For today's movie review, I'll be reviewing yet another installment of the MCU with Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, a movie that I was really skeptical about when I first heard it was announced for the following reasons. Reason number one, the moment I heard Shang-Chi was gonna get his own movie, I sat there saying, wow, Marvel must really be scraping the bottom of the barrel and find a character to make a movie out of, given that way before the Marvel Cinematic Universe even existed, this was the status quo of all of these characters back in the day. Spider-Man was considered to be A tier, Iron Man was a B tier character, Guardians of the Galaxy, both the original incarnation and the newer incarnation, C tier characters, and then you got Shang-Chi, who I always considered to be a D tier character at best. A character so obscure that the only thing I knew about Shang-Chi was that he was a character that wore a red suit, who was often considered to be one of the greatest martial arts masters within the Marvel comics, who was created by Marvel in order to cash in on the 1960s, 1970s martial arts craze going on around that time period in Hollywood. Other than that, nothing else. Reason number two, when I heard the subtitle of The Legend of the Ten Rings, with Marvel executives confirming that not only would we see the return of the Ten Rings organization, but it was also confirmed that the main villain of the movie was going to be the Mandarin. And I was pissed, because if there's any Marvel villain I wanted to see get adapted onto the big screen, it was the Mandarin from the Iron Man comics, in that sense where not only is he Iron Man's #1 arch nemesis, but it would have been a very cool thing to see in a movie, in that sense where we have Iron Man who uses technology to fight against someone who uses magic. That would have been an awesome thing to see in a movie, but when Iron Man 3 came out, promising Iron Man would fight the Mandarin in that movie, we never got to see Tony Stark fight that version of the Mandarin. Instead, we got Tony Stark fighting Aldrich Killian, a character who was given a much more expanded role in the movie, since the only thing his comic counterpart was known for was create extremis and killing himself. So yeah, having Iron Man not fight the comic book accurate Mandarin was perhaps one of the biggest letdowns for me in regards to Marvel adapting their characters for a movie. So I was just really peeved that here's a movie that's going to reintroduce the Mandarin, but instead of having him fight Iron Man, he's gonna fight a D-list character like Shang-Chi. So I was disappointed already. Reason number three, I was afraid that this movie was going to become the next Black Panther, in that sense where you have a movie featuring a predominantly Asian-heavy cast that would get praised to high heavens because it's the first superhero movie to be focused on an Asian character, even though we've had other Asian superheroes from the Japanese side of things, ranging from the likes of Ultraman, Kamen Rider, Kikaider, One Punch Man, My Hero Academia. I could go on, but anywho. Getting back to Shang-Chi, on the other hand, on top of getting praised for having a Asian-heavy cast, I thought Shang-Chi was gonna be yet another case where if you had someone who criticized the movie for legit reasons, you would have the people defending it say, oh, this person's clearly racist, even if the critique they have about the movie is legit. Kind of like how people point out how bad the CGI was in Black Panther, and a lot of people said, oh, that person's racist, even though they're just criticizing the really bad CGI. I thought it was going to be one of those kind of cases. But sure enough, when the movie did eventually premiere, it was met with some high praise, and the movie eventually came and went. And for my final reason in terms of why I was so skeptical about the movie, I'll actually discuss this in the review itself. Which begs the question, is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings any good? Which begs the question, is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings any good? As for the plot of the movie, a former Ten Rings assassin who left the organization tries to live a normal life, thinking that his past wouldn't catch up to him. And while living his normal life as Sean, things get complicated when an assassin sent by his father, the leader of the Ten Rings, who wants to get his hands on one part of his mother's pendant. To make matters even worse, Sean discovers that his younger sister, who, much like him, also left the organization with the other half of their mother's pendant, has also become a target of the Ten Rings organization. However, upon being captured by their father, father's organization, the two siblings soon discovered that their father wants to use their mother's pendant in order to find a mystical village, since their father is under the impression that their mother is still alive and well and being held captive by said mystical village. And as our heroes continue to confront their father's organization, they soon discover a much more sinister threat is on the horizon. In terms of what I liked about the movie, I have said this time and time again in some of my other reviews for the MCU movies, but I do like the fact that Marvel continues to incorporate a different movie genre into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, much like how Ant-Man was a heist movie, Captain America: The First Avenger was a pulp action adventure, Spider-Man: Homecoming was a high school comedy, so on and so forth. And Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings definitely continues this trend by being a martial arts fantasy movie within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is something that has not been done up to this point. And because Shang-Chi falls into this movie genre, it somehow completely changes the flavor of the movie. Because when you go into a MCU Marvel movie, doesn't matter what character you're watching it for, you could tell very clearly that it is a Marvel movie. And even though Shang-Chi is a Marvel movie and has a lot of the same kind of mannerisms that your standard MCU movie would have, but somehow by making this movie a martial arts fantasy movie, it changes the vibe around so much that it felt like I was watching something brand new for the first time in years. Something so new and different that it didn't feel like a MCU Marvel movie. It felt completely different, separated from the rest of the MCU, that I had to remind myself time and time again that, oh yeah, this is a Marvel movie. Now, I know I'm most likely alone on this, but whatever Marvel did during the production of this movie, they should continue it for their future installments, because the vibe this movie presented felt so refreshing and strangely nostalgic in that sense, where watching this movie, it made me think back to a lot of those martial arts movies that came out during the early 2000s, ranging from the likes of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, House of Flying Daggers, Hero, along with The Forbidden Kingdom. It made me think back to those type of movies. And while on the subject of the martial arts genre, I would actually like to talk about the actual martial arts themselves, at least in terms of the action fight choreography presented within the movie. Because again, we've never seen this type of action within a MCU Marvel movie before. And the actual fight scenes themselves felt like a nice blend of different types of martial arts actions we've seen in other movies. Because a lot of the fight choreography in the first half of the movie felt very reminiscent to that of a fight scene you would see in a Jackie Chan movie, while the martial arts action seen in the later half of the movie felt very reminiscent to that of something akin to Shaolin Soccer, or, as I mentioned earlier, The Forbidden Kingdom. I felt like there was a nice blend of different types of martial arts action seen within this movie. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the plot, because it's not what I thought it was going to be. Because initially when I heard the announcement that Marvel was going to make a movie based on Shang-Chi, the first thing that immediately that came to my mind was, I thought they were going to do like a Mortal Kombat styled movie within the MCU where you have Shang-Chi taking part in some type of martial arts tournament, but we don't get that. Instead, we get what I would consider to be your standard action-adventure story, in that sense where we go from point A to point B to point C, but at this movie's core, it's really about the broken relationship between father and son, which leads into another aspect of the movie I really enjoyed, is the relationship between our main hero and villain, given that both Shang-Chi and Wenwu are both a father-son duo. Something we haven't seen since Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, when we had Star-Lord confronting Ego the Living Planet. And while Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 introduced the concept of having our main hero be related to our main villain within the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think this movie does that relationship a lot better. Because with something like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, Star-Lord literally meets his dad for the first time, and even though he gets along with him at first, he then suddenly turns against him for killing Peter's real mother, eventually leading to their big confrontation, with Star-Lord coming to the conclusion that although Ego is his father, Yondu is his daddy, ending with Peter losing two father figures in that movie, both in a physical and an emotional sense. With the relationship between Shang-Chi and Wenwu, it's one of those cases where we see their entire relationship from start to finish, seeing just how much Wenwu really did love Shang-Chi before his mother died, but after his mother died and Wenwu started taking up the Ten Rings again, becoming a grieving vengeful madman, essentially corrupting Shang-Chi into becoming an assassin at a very young age, thus resulting in the broken relationship between father and son. That leads into a lot of intense emotional moments between Shang-Chi and Wenwu throughout the course of the movie. And before I go any further, I would actually like to talk about the plot again in terms of how it's structured. Because I think at this point we all know the Marvel formula. Within the first act of the movie, the hero gets their power or weapon that makes them the superhero we know them today. Second act of the movie is them trying to practice their superpower, and then the third act of the movie is them getting their shit together to fight the main threat of the movie, having some sort of mastery over their core abilities. With this movie, on the other hand, the main hero is pre-established to a point where they already know martial arts, and they have that skill from start to finish. And while we definitely do see him train with a new martial arts in the last act of the movie, it is nice that the main character doesn't start from ground zero working their way up. No, they're already at a pre-established baseline for their abilities, but they improve upon them as the movie progresses. And not only that, but throughout the movie, we actually get flashbacks to him in his younger days training under the tutelage of his father. So we literally don't have to do that whole thing of having the character start from ground zero, working their way up. No, I actually do find it kind of refreshing that the character is already on a baseline and they improve upon their skills as the movie progresses. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the origin behind Wenwu himself, in terms of his relationship with the Ten Rings, because depending on who is reigning for the Mandarin is either someone who found these 10 rings in a crater because they came from outer space, or he's someone who found them in some kind of tomb. And I do like the fact that at the very beginning of the movie, they actually do establish that as time progressed, so did the story of the man who found the 10 rings, as a man who either found them in a crater or found them in a tomb. So I do like the fact that they keep the origin of the rings themselves very vague. And even though we don't know the exact origin behind the rings, I do like how they show what the rings themselves are capable of doing and how they function. To me, it's very reminiscent to Diana's origin in the 2017 Wonder Woman movie, where they kind of mix and match her origins from the comics, in that sense where for the majority of the movie, we believe she's actually this warrior that was sculpted of clay brought to life by Zeus, since that was her origin for a good majority of the time. But then some time later, she was rewritten to be a demigod daughter of Zeus, which is what she ended up being in the movie. So I do like how within this movie, they do mix and match the origin of how the titular Mandarin got his hands on the rings, but they kept it vague enough to explore the real origins of the Ten Rings for future installments of the MCU. And the movie has some really good lines of dialogue, my two favorites being a blood debt must be paid with blood, because to me that is the most sinister sounding line of dialogue I've heard in some time. And then of course the other one, which in my opinion is the best quote of the entire movie, that being, if you aim at nothing, you hit nothing. I was really pleasantly surprised to hear this line of dialogue, because I wasn't expecting a Marvel movie to have a line of dialogue that was that deep. Well, deep for a Marvel movie. The acting from all of the characters I thought was on point and needed to do what they needed to do. But if there's one performance that actually stood out to me the most, it would have to go to Awkwafina's character of Katie. Because initially when I first saw her in the movie, I dreaded the type of character she was going to be, in that sense where I thought she was going to be one of those comical relief characters whose main purpose is to just be the obnoxious comical relief character and contribute nothing to the story. And for the good majority of their screen time, they would literally just be cracking jokes throughout the entire movie with no pause button whatsoever, like Darcy from Thor the Dark World. But with Awkwafina's character Arcadia in this movie, she's not that at all. If anything, she's a comical relief character who actually contributes quite a bit to the movie, from the various action scenes revolved around her driving a car, to her shooting the arrow at the Dweller in Darkness's neck. And even though she is the comical relief character in the movie, they don't make her obnoxiously comical. Like, yeah, she has some comical moments here and there, but they know how to tone her back. Especially during the last third, when we see her talking to Shang-Chi about him soon confronting his father, she actually has a very dramatic moment with him at that moment, and doesn't crack a joke. It actually lets the dramatic moment be a dramatic moment. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the special effects. I thought the special effects, at least on the CGI front, were predominantly very good, even during the climax, which I will talk about in a few minutes. But perhaps my favorite usage of CGI within the context of the entire movie occurs during the final battle between Shang-Chi and Wenwu, when you see the two of them using the 10 rings against each other. Because there's a moment where the rings interlock with each other, and I love the tiny contrasting details between the particle beam used to represent Shang-Chi and the particle beam to represent Wenwu. On top of having each particle beam being represented by the contrasting colors of orange and blue, the texture to each particle beam is very different depending on who's using the 10 rings. Because when you look at the way Shang-Chi uses the 10 rings, the particle beam for him, on top of being orange, design-wise, it's very solid, clean, and looks very strong. Now, contrast this with Wenwu's particle beam when the 10 rings are under his command. On top of being blue, the actual particle beam looks very corrupted, turbulent, and it takes on the form of lightning bolts. Another aspect of the movie I liked is the inclusion of the mystical creatures when our main cast of characters enter Ta Lo, because the creatures they encounter aren't something that was originated from the comics. They're actual creatures from Chinese mythology. And I do like the fact that not only did the producers of the movie decide to include some of these more lesser known creatures in not just Chinese mythology, but really any mythology in general, and introduce them into a major blockbuster like Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, but I also like that the creatures themselves, for what little time we do see them, actually do serve a purpose in the movie. The one that sticks out the most would be the Kuai Lin, and depending on what source you read up on these creatures, they're sort of like the Chinese equivalent to the chimera from Greek mythology, in that sense where they usually have a head of a dragon, the body of a horse, and the scales of a fish. And we see our main cast of characters stumble upon a herd of Kuai Lins, with one of them looking directly at our main cast of characters. And it's only for a brief moment, but I do think this was done intentionally, because Kuai Lins in Chinese mythology are usually associated with the foretelling of great deeds and destinies of certain individuals, such as the case with Confucius, because in actual Chinese mythology, when Confucius' mother was pregnant with him at the time, a Kuai Lin showed up and spat out a jade tablet that foretold all of the great deeds that Confucius would end up doing. Hence, why we end up seeing a Kuai Lin staring at our main cast of characters for that one moment, hinting at the climax of the movie. Then you have the most recognizable creature of the movie of the Hongdan, which is what Morris is, the six-legged, four-winged, faceless fluffball. And these creatures have a very complicated history within Chinese mythology, depending on your source, but from my understanding, they are creatures that typically dwell within mountains, that love dancing and singing, which is why we see Morris being really good friends with Trevor Slattery, given that he is a thespian, given that he's a stage actor, so he does a lot of singing, dancing for Wenwu. Or in some depictions of Chinese mythology, the Hongdan are really representation of this one primordial faceless being who is said to be the harbinger of chaos. Yeah, like I said, they have a very complicated history within Chinese mythology, but I do think that the Hongdan we do see that is Morris, I think makes for a great addition to the movie. Then, of course, you got some of the other creatures, such as the nine-tailed fox, at least a Chinese depiction of one, because there is a difference between how nine-tailed foxes are depicted in Chinese mythology and in Japanese mythology. And then, of course, you have the firebirds, which most people think are a phoenix, but in reality, they're most likely a vermilion bird. And, of course, last but not least, you have the Great Protector herself, who is a dragon, more specifically, a dragon that's depicted in Chinese mythology, in that sense where they typically have a serpentine-like body, they have no wings, they have antlers on their head, and they usually have domain over water and actually are able to control it. Because in most Asian mythologies, more specifically Chinese mythologies, dragons are often seen as being great protectors, unlike their European counterparts, in which they're usually seen as a destructive force of nature that needs to be slain. And before I go any further, no, the Dweller in Darkness is not a monster that originated from Chinese mythology. That's a character that actually originated from a Doctor Strange comic, which I'll explain later, but moving on. And for the last aspect of the movie I liked is the climax itself. And before I go any further, there's something I need to address about that climax, because at the time of the movie's release, one of the biggest criticisms I've heard from everybody across the board was that the climax of the movie was too CG heavy. And the way people talked about it, they talked about it in the same vein as the 2017 Wonder Woman movie. And so going into this, I was very worried about the movie on that front because, to remind you, I was never the biggest fan of the climax to the 2017 Wonder Woman movie because I thought the CGI didn't look very good and felt they didn't really need to go in that kind of direction. With Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, on the other hand, I actually really do enjoy the final battle of the movie because it's a giant monster battle. And if you pay attention to my channel long enough, I love Daikaiju Ega. This is the closest thing that Marvel is going to have to a giant monster movie within the confines of the MCU. Sure, I will admit there's some parts where the CGI looks a little spotty, but overall I actually thought the CGI used for the giant monster battle looked predominantly very good. Now, in terms of aspects of the movie I have mixed feelings on, the pacing is kind of inconsistent in that sense where the first third moved at a really fast pace because it had this momentum going from one scene to the next. However, by the time you get to the start of the second act of the movie until the end of the movie, that momentum just disappears. And while the pacing from the start of the second act of the movie until the end is very consistent and moves at a steady pace, it just doesn't have the same type of momentum that first third did, which I think is very unfortunate. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the fight between the Abomination and Wong that occurs in the middle of the movie for a couple reasons. Reason number one, it's actually nice to see the Abomination being featured in an MCU movie again, because the last time we saw the Abomination was back in The Incredible Hulk, which came out in 2008, and the character of the Abomination hasn't reappeared until this movie, which came out in 2021. Between 2008 and 2021, that is approximately a 13-year gap. And keep in mind, the MCU actually has tried to incorporate the Abomination in multiple MCU movies, one of the big ones being Avengers Age of Ultron. However, plans fell through during production and the character was ultimately scrapped from Age of Ultron. And so on top of that, I actually do like the fact that the producers of the Marvel Cinematic Universe are actually trying to incorporate some of the characters and events that transpired in the 2008 Incredible Hulk movie into the modern MCU. Because ever since that movie came out, a lot of people label that movie being the black sheep of the MCU because it's not like any other movie. Which is why between Phase 1 and Phase 3, I feel like Marvel was reluctant to really incorporate any material from that movie because they know that people really didn't like that movie. But I am glad that they are, because I feel that movie is very underrated or underrecommended within the grand scheme of the MCU. Plus, the overall design aesthetics of the Abomination looks more like his comic book counterpart than the one that appears in the 2008 movie, because I understood why the producers at the time decided to make the Abomination brown instead of a dark green, given that he was fighting the Hulk, who was also green, but I never understood why they changed the design up so much. So I do like the fact that the design for the Abomination in this movie resembles his comic book counterpart in that sense where he's a darker shaded green, has a more reptilian look to him, even has those webbed ears. He's even wearing the blue Speedo thing that he's known for wearing in the comics, as opposed to the brown uber-human design that was featured in the 2008 Incredible Hulk movie. However, my biggest problem with the fight between the Abomination and Wong all revolves around Wong himself, because I have several questions going through my mind that come down to the following. 1, why is he at this fight club with the Abomination? 2, how and why is he friends with the Abomination? 3, why is he even in the movie? I mean, I understand why the Abomination is in this movie, given that his fight with Wong in this movie is an important plot point in the, at the time, Marvel Disney Plus show She-Hulk, the Attorney at Law. But why Wong is in the movie itself, I don't get it. Aside from Asian representation, this is just one of those cases where you could have cut him out of the movie and nothing would have changed. I feel like if you're going to include this character, I feel like he should have been more integral to the plot. For example, maybe instead of having Trevor return from Iron Man 3, maybe have it be that the Ten Rings capture him as well, because it turns out this incarnation of the character hailed from the same village that Wenwu is trying to reach in order to save his wife. And then the rest of the movie would play out the exact same way, where Shang-Chi and his friends join forces with Wong in order to fight against the Ten Rings organization. And for the remainder of the movie, we learn more about Wong himself in terms of why he left the village, what the purpose of the village is really about, and also explains what the Dweller in the Darkness is. As this fight sits, while it's an important plot point for the She-Hulk TV show, it really has no bearing on this movie to a point where you could have cut it out of the movie altogether. Another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on is the main villain himself of Wenwu, aka the real Mandarin. Because ever since Iron Man 3 first came out back in 2013, and that movie's depiction of the Mandarin was met with such negative reception that not only did Marvel Studios make multiple public apologies about the depiction of the Mandarin, they even made a Marvel one-shot short film called All Hail the King, where the general premise of that short film is Trevor, aka the fake Mandarin, is being interviewed by someone who he thinks is actually a documentary filmmaker, but is actually a member of the Ten Rings organization whose real purpose is to break him out of that prison for the sole purpose of bringing Trevor to the real Mandarin, that way the real Mandarin, or Wenwu, can actually kill him. And keep in mind, that short film was made back in 2014. Fast forward to 2019 when Marvel Phase 4 was announced, and Kevin Feige talked about Shang-Chi and the Legend of Ten Rings being a part of that phase. He did mention that the movie would feature the real Mandarin, with this movie serving as a massive retcon for Iron Man 3. And I'm not gonna lie, at the time I heard that announcement, I was really disappointed that the Mandarin was gonna be the main villain of this movie, given that when I think of Iron Man's rogue gallery, his number one arch nemesis is the Mandarin, and they're making a movie in which he's the main villain, but it's not an Iron Man movie. So it just seems like a really big disappointment that we never got to see Tony Stark fight the real Mandarin in some shape or form. And on top of that, I was also worried about how they were going to depict him in the movie, given that what I knew at the time of Shang-Chi, again, all I know is that he was a character who's basically some type of martial arts master, and I thought, oh, it's going to be one of those things where the main hero's going to fight the main villain, who's going to be in some shape or form an evil doppelganger of the main hero. And if you've seen any of my past reviews of any installment of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I have discussed time and time again how I was always sick and tired of seeing the main hero fight the villain, who in some shape or form is meant to be like the evil version of the main hero. And I have said this again, it's okay to do that in Phase 1 because it's in Phase 1, but we're in Phase 4 and we're still doing that. I'm kind of sick of it. Now, fast forward to the eventual release of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. When people talked about the movie, one of the high points that everybody agreed with was that Wenwu, aka the real Mandarin, is considered to be one of the best villains of the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. So I was generally curious about the depiction of the real Mandarin, and here are my overall thoughts on Wenwu, aka the real Mandarin. I'm going to start with the negative stuff first. The first being that, as I said a few seconds ago, I am still disappointed that the Mandarin is the main villain to a Marvel movie that has nothing to do with Iron Man. Because I actually would have liked to have seen Tony Stark interact with this version of the Mandarin. I think they really could have had a cool fight scene between Iron Man and this version of the Mandarin. Second, I really don't like the costume design he has throughout the movie. Because when the movie first starts, I actually like the armored look he has in that opening fight scene. But as the movie progresses, he loses that armor and just gets this costume that I think is very lame because of how basic it is. It just consists of a single black suit. It's not even that interesting to look at. I think it would have been cool to see him wearing a costume that looks very reminiscent to that armored look he had at the beginning of the movie. Then I think it would have been a great design. Now, in terms of what I liked about this depiction of the character, first off, it's actually nice to see the proper Mandarin depicted in film as opposed to Aldrich Killian. Like, this This guy right here, I totally believe is the real Mandarin. And on top of that, while I don't consider him to be the best villain of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I definitely do get where people are coming from in terms of Wenwu being considered one of the better villains of the MCU. Because unlike a good majority of villains in the MCU, where they're people who are trying to conquer the Earth or destroy it in some shape or form, here's a guy who started out as a conqueror, but then until he meets Shang-Chi's mother, he's a guy that just abandoned that lifestyle and just wanted to be a family man. But then suddenly when his wife gets killed, he turns into a grieving madman who will go at great lengths to reunite with his beloved because he no longer seeks power, but love. And another aspect of the movie I have mixed feelings on are the way the titular 10 rings themselves are depicted for this movie, because on the one hand, they're not comic book accurate in that sense where the actual rings in the comics were literally rings that the Mandarin wore on each of his fingers, and each ring, depending on who was writing the character at the time, grants them a different power. For example, one allows them to emit ice, lightning, the ability to fly through air, another one that allows them to rearrange atoms and molecules, or one that allows them to use psionic energy, so on and so forth. However, with Thanos using the Infinity Stones, I can see why the producers of this movie decided to go in a different direction with the 10 rings in this movie, because I think they didn't want people to compare the 10 rings to the Infinity Gauntlet. So they decided to go in a different direction by having the 10 rings be not magical items that go on each of the Mandarin's fingers that grant him a different superpower, but instead have them be weapons that function the same way that iron rings are used for various martial arts styles. Kind of like how the iron rings were used in the 2004 martial arts comedy Kung Fu Hustle, but with the added bonus that they have some kind of magical power to them that can be used as weapons themselves for both long range and short range combat that are used in some pretty creative ways. And before I go any further, even though I actually do like this depiction of Wenwu as the real Mandarin, I am still peeved that we never got to see a more comic accurate version of the Mandarin fight Iron Man back in Iron Man 3, because when you really sit down and think about it, the executives of Marvel Studios could have introduced some concepts and foreshadowing that could have led to later events in some of the future Marvel movies. For example, maybe they could have had the Mandarin be a former master of the mystic arts, slowly introducing aspects that would play into Doctor Strange. And because most people kind of view the 10 rings as a poor man's Infinity Gauntlet, this could have been a really clever way of foreshadowing Iron Man's eventual confrontation with Thanos in the Avengers Infinity War movie. It just seems like a very missed opportunity. But moving on. Now, in terms of the problems that I have with the movie, the humor, while I found some jokes to be funny, a good majority of jokes fell flat for me. The biggest offender being the joke that occurs on the airplane, because the way the scene plays out, when you have Shang-Chi telling Katie his backstory on the airplane, it's done in a flashback that's very dark and dramatic, but then suddenly it gets interrupted with a very typical juvenile MCU joke, and then after that's over, he goes back to telling the story again, and the producers of the movie should not have done that. Because I know in past several movies, anytime you have a dark, dramatic moment, it sometimes is often followed up with a comical moment to lighten the mood, to balance out the darker moments. But this here, you literally started with a darker moment, it gets interrupted with a comical moment, and then it goes back to being dark again. And here's the thing, the filmmakers of the movie shouldn't have done that, because it's either you start the moment off with a comical moment that goes into a darker moment, or you start out dark and then end with a comical moment. You can't just start the moment off on a dark tone and then interrupt it with a comical moment and then go back to being dark again. All it does is provide tonal backlash for that entire moment. Another problem that I have with the movie is the lack of tension between Shang-Chi and Wenwu. And when I mean lack of tension, I mean from a physical standpoint, because there is definitely a lot of tension going on between the two of them from an emotional standpoint, considering that Shang-Chi was trained at a very young age to become an assassin by his father, so there was a lot of pent-up emotions between the two of them in that standpoint. I thought those were handled well. But when it comes to the actual physical confrontation between the two of them, it doesn't really happen that often. If anything, they fight twice in the entire movie. The problem is it doesn't occur until the climax. Because here's the thing, in a lot of these superhero movies, usually you introduce your characters in the first act, and then they get into a confrontation with the villain either at the end of the first act or at the start of the second act, and they fight throughout the second act of the movie, and then fight the final time during the third act. This here, for a good majority of the movie, they do not fight each other until the last third. And I feel like they really should have had maybe 1 or 2 action scenes between him and his father in the middle of the movie or during a flashback. Another problem that I have with the movie has to do with Wenwu again, but the problems that I have with him here are different than the problems that I have discussed about him a few minutes ago. The first one being the character's overall reception, because at the time of the movie's release, it doesn't matter if I was looking into reviews that were done by professional movie critics or movie-going audience members alike, Wenwu got universal praise to such a high point that everyone agreed that not only was he considered to be one of the best villains of the MCU, but there are even some people out there who consider him to be the best villain of the MCU. And I'll say this much, while I definitely do agree that he is a very good villain, I don't think he's the best villain of the MCU. I would place him maybe within the top 10, but the number 1 best villain of the MCU? Not even close. So I thought the character was a little overhyped in some ways, because the second problem I have with the character is that everyone misunderstands him. Because between the posters and the advertisement for the movie, you think Wenwu is the main villain of the movie. And even though he is the major antagonist of the movie, he's not the main villain. In actuality, the main villain of the movie is the Dweller in Darkness to be the real main villain of the movie as opposed to Wenwu. And here is my reason as to why I consider the Dweller in Darkness to be the real villain of the movie. The Dweller in Darkness is a puppet master, and Wenwu is his puppet. He literally manipulates Wenwu into thinking that not only is his beloved alive and trapped in this mystical village, but he also convinces Wenwu into freeing him. And all of the events that have occurred in the movie are because of the Dweller in Darkness. Not because of Wenwu, because of the Dweller in Darkness. He has the most influence over the entire movie. And speaking of the Dweller in Darkness, even though I consider him to be the main villain of the movie, because he has the most influence over the movie's plot, I feel that he should have been built up a lot more. Because we literally don't learn about the Dweller in Darkness until the end of the second act of the movie, before the big climactic battle. Because we might get one hint when we see Wenwu talking to a spiritual manifestation of what we think is his wife. I just think that for something that has the most influence over the movie's narrative, its presence should have been felt more throughout. As it sits, the Dweller in Darkness feels like a last-minute addition to the movie, even though he has the most influence over the movie's plot. Also, why is the Dweller in Darkness the main villain of this movie? Because the actual character of the Dweller in Darkness is actually a recurring villain from the Doctor Strange comics, given that he's actually one of the Lords of Fear. And his overall appearance looks like that of Cthulhu if his skin was more blue in color, who wore like a silver knight suit. Here, they just designed him like he's some kind of demonic wyvern. And I started thinking, this was a missed opportunity, because if this wasn't the Dweller in Darkness, all the filmmakers had to do was change the design around just enough to make the monster of the movie look more like a European dragon, give him some green scales, and you would have Fin Fang Foom. Although, given that most people would probably find that name ridiculous, I could imagine the creature being called Fang or something. Because in the Iron Man comics, both the Mandarin and Fin Fang Foom have an on and off relationship with each other, in that sense where sometimes the Mandarin commands Fin Fang Foom, or in some cases Fin Fang Foom commands the Mandarin. And given that the Dweller in the Darkness literally manipulates Wenwu, the real Mandarin, into doing his bidding, I feel like the Dweller in Darkness should have just been Fin Fang Foom. And another problem I have with the movie is something that I hinted at the very beginning of this review is, how is this movie going to tie in with the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe? Because when Phase 2 was announced way back in the day, things that we were expecting, a third Iron Man movie, a second Thor, Captain America, and Avengers movie. Ant-Man, okay, that was a surprise, but that one made sense. But then Guardians of the Galaxy, to most casual moviegoers at the time, everyone was like, who? Whereas most of the comic book fans, myself included, went, really? We're getting a movie about this group of characters first instead of someone like Doctor Strange or Black Panther? But at the time, I understood why the producers of the MCU decided to include the Guardians of the Galaxy in Phase 2 of all things, for the simple fact that that movie was introducing characters, concepts, and plot points that would play a major part in future installments of the MCU. So I understood why the filmmakers at the time decided to make a movie about this group of really obscure comic book characters. With Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, on the other hand, I'm not really seeing how this is going to contribute to the MCU in the long run. Sure, I know the mid-credit scene where you have Shang-Chi, Katie, and Wong talking to Bruce Banner and Carol Danvers about the Ten Rings themselves. Sure, it's hinting at something, but I'm not seeing how this whole movie is going to affect the entire MCU moving forward. And for the final problem that I have with the movie is the ending. And when I mean ending, I'm not talking about the climax. I'm talking about the way the movie actually ends. Because you have that point in time where you have that wide shot of all of the lanterns floating on the lake and you see the dragons swimming around them. If the movie just ended there, it would have been fine. However, the movie goes on for a few more minutes with Shang-Chi and Katie hanging out with their friends at the bar, telling them about the events of the movie. A few moments later, Wong shows up, summoning both Shang-Chi and Katie to Kamatage in wanting to discuss something. Personally, I think this entire sequence should have been a mid-credit scene, because as the movie sits with that ending intact, on top of it feeling tacked on, the movie ends in a way where it just feels like it's sequel baiting. I know that might sound really weird given that this is a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and the past several Marvel movies have done that in the past, and in some cases it worked very well, but this is the one time where I think Marvel Studios didn't need to end the movie on that kind of note, given that we already know that this is a part of the MCU, and we know that this is going to connect to future projects, and we don't need to be reminded of the fact that Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is a part of the MCU. If the movie ended in the way I suggested it ended, with the lanterns on the lake with the dragon, it would have presented Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings as a standalone installment that takes place within the Marvel Cinematic Universe that would eventually tie into the MCU. As the movie sits, it's just another installment of the MCU that will eventually connect with the rest of the universe. So for my final verdict of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, if I had to describe my experience with this movie, I put it in the same category that I had with Captain America the Winter Soldier. And when I mean that, I'm not saying this movie's as good as the Winter Soldier, but more in that sense where when I went into the movie, I went in with super low expectations, thinking it wasn't going to be a good movie. But after watching the movie, it was much better than expected, to a point where I actually think it's one of the better installments of the MCU. And for the record, Winter Soldier is still objectively the better made movie compared to this, but I still think Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is a really great movie in its own right, despite the problems I have with it. That said, I'll say this, out of any of the recent installments of the MCU, this is perhaps the most fun I've had with an installment of the MCU since the original Guardians of the Galaxy movie. So overall, Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is another great addition to the MCU that honestly feels like a much better live-action adaptation of Dragon Ball Z than the actual live-action Dragon Ball movie. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings? So it looks like the movie got generally positive reception. And so for my final rating of Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, I give it a 4 out of 5. So what is your favorite fight scene in any martial arts movie? And see you later.